Hello, friends. Welcome to the final stream in King Arthur Day. If you have made it from 9 o'clock in the morning straight through to now, congratulations, you're an absolute champ. In this stream, we're going to be discussing King Arthur in film because we often, when we talk about the Arthurian tradition, it's quite natural to talk about the literature, maybe some of the visual art, and see the films as really just adaptations of those things. But actually, they have a life of their own. It is its own media, and it's probably the most direct means for a contemporary audience to engage with King Arthur. And so, as a nice way to end the day, we're going to be discussing particularly two of those films to do with King Arthur. And joining me to do this, I am delighted to have three wonderful guests. I have with me Simon Roberts. Hello, Simon. How are you doing?
Good evening, Nathan. Good evening, Mr. D. Good evening, Lady of Shalott and chat. Lovely to be here.
It's great to have you here. And I think this is the first time we've actually been on a stream together.
Yes, I've been on a hiatus of streaming for a while, and I just decided to get back on. So here I am. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. And we also have Lady of Shalott. Hello again, Lady.
Oh, greetings to everyone in the chat. Greetings to Mr. D, to yourself, and to the one and only Simon. It's lovely to be back. I've really disappeared for the past few months. I've been really ill. I'm still in treatment, but it has been wonderful to step out of that for a while and step into the world of King Arthur, which is I've been enthralled to for many years.
Yeah, you've. I mean, your name says that.
Oh,
very much
just
so,
a
right?
slight hint. Yeah.
But also, you have contributed already to King Arthur Day, and if
Yes.
folks haven't seen your video already, I thoroughly recommend that they do because it was absolutely fantastic introduction to King Arthur in the 19th century.
Yes, because I think the 19th century was really when everything that we now see as Arthuriana really came into the public sphere. Really did.
And last but not least, I would like to introduce Mr. D. Hello, Mr. D. How are you doing?
Hello, Mr. Hood and panel. I feel sort of. Does anyone remember that show called After Dark, where they would have like various British intellectuals?
I do.
Such, I feel like that. Where I promise not to be Oliver Reed. If anyone remembers that infamous.
I actually saw that. Yeah.
Is that the one where he's really drunk and starts chatting up a feminist? Is that right?
He embraces a feminist. Yes.
He grabbed who was it? I can't remember.
I think Mr. D. It was Andrea Dworkin.
No, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
Was it Kate Millett?
It was Kate Millett. Yeah, it was Kate Millett. Yeah, he grabs her and kisses her. He gives her a very he rolls over the back of the sofa and gives her a sloppy kiss, and then he's voted out of the show, like it's it's Pop Idol or something. Anyway, wonderful to be here. Thank you, Mr. Hood, and again, hello to my esteemed companion.
Well, we are here to discuss the films of King Arthur, and in particular, Excalibur and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, although there will be, of course, room to discuss others. And just by way of opening, I was looking at, what kind of films have been made about King Arthur, and there's just so many. I was thinking of Camelot in the 1960s, based on the musical. There's Lancelot de Lac, which we might touch on. The First Knight, I think, does that star Sean Connery? Is that right? As King Arthur, and I can't remember who else is in it now. There's also Dragonheart, which relates back to King Arthur in various ways. There's the 2004 Clive Owen and Keira Knightley King Arthur.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's the Merlin TV show by the BBC. And then in 2017, Guy Ritchie made a King Arthur film, which sounds absolutely awesome. Like this combination.
He did indeed.
What was it like? Did you see it?
Oh dear. Unfortunately, but I saw it by accident, and that a person I live with was watching it, and it was on the television. Oh dear. Yeah, I would give that a miss. I really would. It's not. It's Guy Ritchie. It just really geezers do Arthur.
Keats do Arthur. I'm just imagining, oh, what's that? Vinnie Jones playing King Arthur or something.
That would have been great. Can you just see him as Merlin or?
But what struck me about this is that actually, there's been several films about Arthur over the preceding decades, even up till relatively recently. And so I was wondering if I want to throw out why do you think King Arthur has been such a subject to be treated in film in so many different ways, when in some respects in a modern time it's often seen as a bit antiquated, not fitting with the times? Why do we keep returning to it?
I think it's a bit like Shakespeare in a way. It's one of those sort of prisms culturally that can refract different themes depending on the time and the approach and the attack that's taken at any one and given moment. I mean, I have theories about the power of the Arthur myth, which we can get into later on. But I looked, like you, before the stream, and there was about 70 odd films, TV shows that either directly address Arthur or sort of annex the myth of Arthur in some form, even the sort of vague connections in the Indiana Jones films or things like that are there. But I think it's this is going to sound a little bit boilerplate, but enduring power of a myth about place and identity, I suppose, which can be somewhat fungible, and it can be sort of rebranded and repurposed for all kinds of other things. And it obviously resonates with the theme of quest, and it resonates particularly in our recent past with even things like Star Wars, things like the Lord of the Rings cycle as well. And so, it's got an evergreen quality that, goes beyond just a simple sort of English located myth.
Definitely. Sorry. I was just going to say you have action, romance, fantasy, and a bit of philosophy in there too, and that strong sense of identity that people need to have a sense of. I discussed it briefly in my video, the sense of nationalism, a sense of something that you can reach back into the past and connect with. And I think Arthur really symbolizes that. And whether or not he ever really existed doesn't really matter, does it? It's what people they need to have a figure like that. Here in Australia, we have Ned Kelly, who's just really a murderous bushranger. But if you don't have a myth and lore, you will make one up. You will find one, and luckily England has Arthur, which is a pretty good.
Yes, and it's the deep. It is a deep sort of mythos of of broadly speaking our people. It is the sort of the kind of one of the I would say because I think that it's also kind of it's both esoteric and transcendent. It's beyond a sort of tale, and I do think that if you look at any sort of true people or true culture, they will have these deep resonant these deep resonant figures and archetypes at their in the midst of their beginning. So I do think it's important in that way as well. And as Mr. Roberts mentioned, it is also planted seeds in so much literature, art, drama, music, even to our present diminished days. So I do think that it's a deep well from which we still find running water.
And I suppose on that point as well, it's something which both creators have, as children read the books and things. But even like in the street, if you ask somebody who King Arthur is, okay, they might not have read any of the stories, but they could probably tell you, oh, there was a king who had a round table and knights and so on and so forth. And so they would know something of it. So even on that level, there's a kind of intuitive collective memory of these tales, which speaks to that kind of deep rootedness, I suppose. So I guess maybe that's a good point to get into our films. And I think maybe although chronologically Monty Python comes first, I think it might be better to actually speak about Excalibur first, because I think it's in some ways it's more continuous with the tradition proper in some ways. And I want to throw it open to you guys for your kind of initial statements on it, or summary, or whatever you thought about it. So Simon, why don't you go?
I can kick off. Yeah, I mean, in the context of this stream, as we, maybe the audience doesn't know, but we discussed Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Excalibur, and Charlotte and I went and looked at an earlier film, in fact, from '74 called Lancelot du Lac by Robert Bresson, and I found weirdly the three films kind of hung together. I mean, and they had a sort of artistic integrity that sort of matched. I mean, I know talking about artistic integrity with Monty Python and the Holy Grail may seem strange to people, but I think there's a consistency about it. And we were chatting before the stream, and talking about are things as good as you remember. I went away and watched Holy Grail again, and I thought actually there were elements of it that were much better than I remembered, and stuff that was kind of subpar. But the unifying things about it are about this notion of the heroic, and these three particular films, the Lancelot du Lac film, the '74 film, the first one, essentially it's the theme of the heroic being stripped out of the telling of the story. The heroic is banished. And the Monty Python, the Holy Grail, it's about the heroic being interrupted, being frustrated constantly. And then you get finally to Excalibur, and these are films made within an 8-year span. It's finally the surrender to the heroic epic. It's this efflorescent emotional opera, rawness, full flourish, mythic size and spirit. You've got Wagner and cinematographic ambition, kinetic force. It's one of those films that, when they say, do you print the truth or the legend? They've printed the legend. So it's kind of distillation of Arthurian sensibility, I think mostly derived from Mallory's Morte d'Arthur. I think some of Chrétien of Troyes as well. But it's the sort of go-to film in a way for me, where you don't have the corruption of people taking it as a story to, the Clive Owen film. I think with Keira Knightley, it's all about, well, we turn Guinevere into a girl boss. They're not trying to sort of engender it with modernist themes, so to speak. This is something that, although it could be a film that is a little bit overblown, a little bit messy, a little bit operatic, and sometimes you feel that there's bits missing, but nonetheless it's the option you sort of would have taken if you said you wanted to make the kind of the pure parfum of the Arthurian myth, the essence that you sort of want to get the highest on. Then that would be Excalibur, I think.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the Bresson film is much bleaker. I mean, it begins with the line, "The Grail has not been found." So some of the characters just couldn't even be bothered to go to look for it. Mordred doesn't go to look for it. He doesn't see the point. So you're dealing with a kind of a very, very bleak landscape, quite hopeless. I mean, the whole tone of the Bresson film is very, very different from Excalibur, but I think they complement each other really well.
Yeah, I have probably a somewhat different opinion of this film. I have described it as being one of the best bad films ever made, and I say that with a wink, because I do think there is a significant amount of just absolutely wonderful kind of, I mean, both cinematic and sort of storytelling moments in the film. I think it is beset problems. I was quite surprised to learn that Excalibur began life as a possible adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, which I didn't know at all. So apparently, Warner Brothers had obtained the rights to make a film of Lord of the Rings, and they offered it to John Boorman. And so the early development of this film was indeed supposed to be a one film telling of Lord of the Rings. Now, obviously, I think they very quickly realized it just wasn't going to work. I think it was difficult enough, at the time, to do a film with this, with this many fantastical elements. And I do think if you watch it, clearly Peter Jackson knew the film very well, because there are some moments in Excalibur that you really see sort of inspiration being transferred to the Jackson film. So But I do think it was a very interesting experiment, and certainly, I mean, it's of its time, but I think it also sort of was part of the early push in the direction of these great, all out kind of fantasy epic films, and in a way, sort of led to for it to be possible to make things like Lord of the Rings several decades later. So yeah, it's very interesting to hear what the rest of you have to say about it.
And just on that subject of the Lord of the Rings, did you ever see the Ralph Bakshi film of the Lord of the Rings that was made around the same time?
Yeah.
I've never seen
Indeed,
that.
it was.
Just curious
You've not
about it.
seen it? Oh,
No,
okay.
no,
I mean,
I've got the soundtrack weirdly for some reason, but I just wonder, what do you think about it?
I think I think that again, there's a lot of brilliance in it, and I think it was a very brave thing to do. It was the only way to make a film of that story, certainly back then. It just wasn't possible. Again, the technical and logistical considerations. It really just wasn't possible to do justice to the story. So the only way to do it really was that animation. I think it's I suppose if he had more money and more time, it probably could have been fleshed out a bit better. It's been many years since I've seen it, but yeah, I certainly remember enjoying it when I saw it when I was quite young.
Well, now that Warner Brothers are releasing new Lord of the Rings productions, I really hope John Boorman gets his crack at it this time round. In the style of Excalibur.
Is the old fellow is he still working?
I think he's about 94.
Yeah, he's got to be in his mid-90s. So.
Yeah.
Let's get a Patreon together for him. A crowd starter.
Crowdfund it.
See, $500 million or so. It should be difficult.
Should be all right. But I think yeah. Well, I guess one thing I wanted to touch on there with what you guys were saying was that Boorman, he integrates a lot of Arthurian stories together into the one. So it's primarily based on the death of Arthur, or the Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory, but it integrates that with stories by Chrétien de Troyes, mainly Percival, but he also introduces ideas and motifs from Wagner works, not just the music, but from the operas, and kind of synthesizes them with characters. And this all comes from his idea, which he kind of shares in an interview, that essentially mythology, there's a flexibility, fluidity, but also a homogeneity to it, because it's all pointing to the same reality for him, I guess, perennial truths. And so you can rearrange the parts and put them together in new ways, but essentially still tell the same story. And to my mind, although that gets around some problems and allows him to tell a certain story within the Arthurian world with a certain set of emphases, it also creates a little bit of convolution, a little bit of difficulty in joining all the parts together, because you're bringing so much together at one time.
Yeah. And one of the things he's doing, I think, is he's, so often when you mention King Arthur, you tend to sort of crash into it in cultural forms as a sort of ready-made world. And what Boorman does is he obviously compresses a great deal of the sort of time span of the Arthurian myth, but it gives you pretty much a beginning to end, an origin story, a development and a final act. And the interesting thing about it is much of it is about the struggle to make men what they might become. You have it starting in a world which is extremely dark and brutal. The knights who begin the story are these they wear this black armor, these pig-faced helmets, they carry torches, and they just generally get off on slaughtering people. And this moves through the story, through the sword being withdrawn from the stone, to this idea that Arthur is someone who comes into the land and he begins to remake. You have the charm of making that Merlin has throughout the film. He begins to sort of recultivate people and, in a sense, embed and implant this idea of the notion of the order of chivalry, if you like. There's also this element parallel to that of, in the supernatural part of the story, Merlin is aware that the one god, so to speak, is coming to replace the old gods and to change this world again. But there's ever this struggle, this energy being put in order to achieve some dream, and the theme of dreams comes up throughout the films. It is a dream I have, and so on, that ends in a sense in failure at the end of the film.
Yes.
It's disastrous really for us, but it has a completeness about it and a promise for the future about it as well. So it is quite an achievement to compress it in that way.
It is, and I really like the contrast between the pagan world of Merlin and, of course, Morgana. They represent the paganism, I suppose, a form of what pantheism, really a worship of nature, and then you contrast that with Arthur, and there's a very kind of Christian narrative going on there. I thought that was really, and as Simon says, Merlin was very aware that his world was coming to an end, and it was a time for kings and for men, and he would fade into the background. I have to say that Nicol Williamson really, for me, made the film. I mean, but when he wasn't on screen, Nicol Williamson played Merlin. When he's not on screen, I miss him. I'm hoping he's going to come back on. He was fantastic. I first saw Excalibur at a very young age, and it made a huge impression on me.
Well, one of the interesting things about Nicol Williamson actually is that, so he had just been in a relationship with Helen Mirren before the film, and they had a terrible breakup. They absolutely hated each other, and Boorman wanted to hire both of them to play Merlin and Morgana respectively, to feed off that hatred that they had for each other.
That's right, because when each of them found out that the other had been cast, they both went to Boorman and said, get rid of him, I'm not playing opposite that person. And he fed upon that chemistry and that antagonism, and it worked brilliantly.
And there is a version of the script out there that was sort of, heavily changed to get to the final product film, but there was a lot more very, very frank sexual expression and tension between Merlin and Morgana as well. That, I mean, may have been dropped for those interpersonal reasons that you're citing.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess maybe you've already alluded to it, Simon, but we could maybe work through some of the plot here. And I guess the first act really revolves around Uther, Arthur's father, who makes a deal with Merlin that, having conquered the land and become the king, he wants the Duke of Cornwall's wife for himself, Igraine. And so Merlin agrees to help him using magical power to come in disguise or as an illusion of the Duke of Cornwall to Igraine, but on the condition that whatever the product is or whatever comes of this is Merlin's to take for himself. And so as this is happening, we also see at the same time the Duke of Cornwall is dying, right? He's being killed. So there's this juxtaposition going on at the same time. And as Uther is conducting this terrible act, Morgana, a young Morgana who's the daughter of the Duke of Cornwall, can see through the illusion. So we're getting the seeds of what might come later. Eventually, what this results in is the birth of Arthur, and Merlin takes Arthur for himself, and a raging Uther chases after him, but is surrounded by enemy knights and his guild, but not before he lays the sword within the stone. So there is this kind of setting up of what's to come in many regards.
Yeah, and there's also this sense that you get that Uther is trying to choose himself to be king, and there is a theme that's really discussed later when Arthur draws the sword from the stone. It's almost a sort of reactionary sensibility in a way that you don't get to choose these things. These things are duties. These are thrust upon you. You just have to put up with this. But Uther can't overcome that. He's a sort of, crude, sexual, grunting kind of, powerhouse machine of violence. And Arthur is this thing that has to happen in order to trim and cultivate this world into something higher.
Oh, absolutely. Merlin tells him, you're not the one. You're not the one to unite the kingdom.
I think also should mention that quite a number of very well known actors. I mean, this was either their first or their very early foray into into cinema. I mean, obviously Gabriel Byrne, who played Uther, and Liam Neeson and Patrick Stewart, and I mean, an early go for Nigel Terry as well.
Yeah. There's also an actor called Kieran Hines, who's now very well known. He plays one of the knights. So there's an incredible Sir Patrick Stewart. I mean, incredible cast, incredible.
Yeah, Corin Redgrave.
Corin Redgrave is the Duke of Cornwall. Yeah.
Bit of a communist, old Corin, by the way.
Oh well, it runs in the family.
I mean, I had a friend who's an actor I interviewed about Corin Redgrave. He was the Workers' Revolutionary Party in the 70s. And he had a chat with Corin Redgrave at sort of lunchtime when they were doing a play together. And Corin Redgrave was basically saying, we would, we'd get a communist government in place and we'd basically give the Russians the keys to our nukes.
Oh, dear.
Great.
So he's...
Something about the Redgraves, I think.
Yeah.
Awful.
I have a sort of a very roundabout connection to Nigel Terry, because he was later on in his career, he performed in quite a number of films that were made by a sort of British art house director called Derek Jarman. So he narrated two of Derek Jarman's films, one called The Last of England and Jarman's last film, Blue. He played Piers Mortimer in Jarman's weird adaptation of Edward II. So he was very much a kind of
almost a muse
for Jarman, who I briefly met his partner, and I got to go to his cottage and on the bleak beach at Dungeness. So it's very interesting to see him in this role. And one of the things about this film is that the cast, they were all great in their own way, but I always had difficulties a bit with Nigel Terry as Arthur. I mean, he almost seems like he certainly as a contrast with Uther Pendragon. He seems a bit kind of meek and bumbling at the beginning of the film, and I've never felt that he quite had the kind of gravitas that one would expect of Arthur. And I do wonder if that was a deliberate choice by Boorman, or if it was just how Terry chose to do the role. I mean, his Bristol accent comes shining through very much. So it's a bit of a shock, I think, when he sort of first comes on the screen. Does anyone else sort of have any?
Oh, definitely.
Less favorites in the cast.
Well, I mean that's the first big screen role for Liam Neeson. He still has quite a thick sort of Irish Ulster accent. The accents are bewildering in Excalibur. They they take a sort of tour around Ireland and maybe hop over to England briefly, and then they come back to Ireland. They just do a sort of tour of the British Isles.
And it has to be said, he filmed it mostly in County Wicklow, didn't he?
Yes, it was. He did indeed. County Wicklow and Kerry, beautiful locations. I think
Guinevere starts with an Irish accent as well, and the actress.
But it's Liam Neeson's first big screen role, and of course where he met.
You dropped there.
Number of years.
Am I still here?
Wonderful. Yeah, it's full of names. You can kind of say, "Oh, that's Patrick Stewart," and that's.
Yeah, I can see why they've done it. I mean, sometimes it's an actor's choice, that you want to do a sort of, a boy who comes from nowhere and makes good story. And one of the sort of shorthands for doing that is they sort of have a, from the gutter accent, and then people who ascend to becoming celebrities, suddenly the accent disappears and they're very, very much more refined.
I guess as well, though, it re-emphasizes a continual refrain that the king and the land are one, or there's a groundedness to this story that's connected with an actual place, and these accents, more than maybe RP or something which is a bit more neutral, they make you immediately think of a connection with a local place. So I wonder if that's part of it as well. But I do agree, Mr. D. I've never found the Arthur in the film particularly somebody who would be a great man of history kind of figure. and that to me is actually the weakest part of the film, is that fact, because you need to believe that all these men would be willing to fight for Arthur, and for it to be this glorious golden age with him at the helm. And I'm not convinced by the acting in that role. But then it could also be that he's surrounded by so many great actors. It's hard to stand out from that as well.
Yeah. I mean, having seen other performances by him, though, I he certainly was, was a very fine actor in his own regard. So I do wonder. I think it's effective at the beginning, certainly when he's young, because he does have this sort of slightly wide-eyed, like slightly sympathetic sort of mane, especially compared to Merlin, who I think is is a quite sort of played as a quite devious character. So the contrast between him and Nicol Williamson is, I think, works very well. But I think, though, then as he becomes the Arthur, as you say, as the king and the land sort of grow and change together, that then there's not enough of a switch.
It's a tricky
also,
part.
I mean, we haven't mentioned the actor who played Lancelot. Very
Nicholas Clay. Yes,
Nicholas
he
Clay.
died. He died very young, unfortunately.
Died
Yes,
very young. Yes, but he was. I mean, just facially, he was perfect for that. He was very striking fellow.
Yes.
I think the difficulty with the Arthur role here, though, is it's very much set up as a kind of avatar for brokenness in some way. That he has to represent, a land that is broken and is healed by the sort of Deus ex machina of the sword, and the magician, and the quest. But he has to sort of struggle sort of manfully all the way. So I think it's a tricky one. It's a bit like playing Othello. It's the kind of lead role of the play, but it's not the best part, if you know what I mean.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's sort of, I mean, I find in his pomp, actually, I think he's very effective, but that sort of ends quite quickly in the court, because by the time he's established, you've got the ructions between the knights beginning to emerge, and the challenge that's made about Guinevere, which ends in the tournament where Lancelot's wounded, and you see at that point he's struggling to keep the factions together, and it's more that he's become the politician that he probably never wanted to be. And so it is one of those tricky roles. I find there's the thing about him, that there's the pathos, I suppose, towards the end of the film, where he is essentially he has this scene with Guinevere where he talks about, this isn't basically the life I wanted, and I have a dream that when I die we will pass into another realm where we can be just man and wife.
That's a beautiful scene, and you see what a good man he is, because he talks about how he always loved her, and she said, "Well, I always loved you as a king, and sometimes as a husband." So he really is a better person than her, and she presents him with Excalibur wrapped in this in a cloth, and I mean, she never presented him with a child, but she presents him with the sword which she has kept for years. That I liked. I thought that was quite symbolic, that she gave him back his sword, but never gave him a son.
It's the difficulty of living as a symbol, as a cipher. He says, "I was not born to live a man's life, but to be the stuff of future memory." How do you play someone who is meant to be that?
And sort of mentioning those scenes, there is some. I mean, despite the sort of slight unevenness of kind of, as you said, weaving all of this together, but there are some really excellent scenes and some great lines as well.
Some very memorable quotes. I mean, "The King and the Land are one" is one that you'll hear in various different contexts. And I think I just wanted to draw on something Simon was talking about the brokenness, because I think it gets to the heart of Boorman's vision for the Arthurian legends, because he first really came to this project when he read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and then following that he read Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance, which was a big influence upon Eliot. And Western's kind of conception of the Holy Grail is that it points back to very early nature rituals, pagan nature rituals about the tying the king or the ruler to the fertility of the people and of the land. And so the quest of the Grail at its heart for her, or at least in its origins, is about that. And so when you look at the story of Excalibur, you know, you have this situation where you see the rise of King Arthur. He then, you know, through both his, in part his own arrogance, but also through the deception of Morgana, and she like Uther uses magic to create this illusion that she is Guinevere, and thus they conceive through incest Mordred. This leads to the kind of wounding of Arthur that can only be healed when Percival finds the Grail, thus leading to this redemption, as you were mentioning, Simon. So for him, this is the kind of heart of the story he's following, and he's trying to place into the story. So in many ways, he's synthesizing King Arthur and the Fisher King in the romance Percival together, thus creating a kind of difficult blend of both the imperial glorious ruler who we find in Geoffrey of Monmouth, who is the main character, and then in the Fisher King, who's a supporting character in the background to the quest of a knight. And so I wonder if that's where the difficulty comes in playing that part.
It feels very much of the time when you're thinking this is being filmed at the end of the 70s, and there is, if you like, a tendency towards a revisionist social history of you know, the suffering of ordinary people. It's very fashionable at that time. It's taking away from elites. So you're not giving us a King Arthur who's basically like a Henry V kind of figure. You are giving these fractured, vulnerable individuals at this moment where things are sort of teetering on the edge of, you know, an economic downturn. I mean, I remember that time particularly. You've got, you know, the 80s, sort of a bleakness stretching ahead, and there is this moment of you know, a man, I suppose, you know, looking into the void and saying, "Who am I?" And that seems to be, you know, thematically congruent with the sort of sensibility of that moment. There wasn't an appetite, let's say, for the heroic in kind of full flourish. There was the beginnings of looking at the as I said, the brokenness of the character. I mean, there are things that shine through to me from Tolkien as well. You know, the sword that is broken, you know, that has to be remade. And there's the bit where, you know, there's another sort of Tolkienian moment where there's the siege of the castle that he goes to Leondegrance' castle. He goes to defend the castle, and he's in the water with Uriens, and there's that moment where he could kill Uriens. He's got Excalibur at his neck, but then he realizes he's not of a station to be able to do that, and he insists that Uriens knight him with Excalibur, which is a brilliant moment, because as Uriens takes Excalibur, it's kind of he's got the one ring, and you can feel the power of the thing itself. He's tempted to use it for his own purposes, and yet something good overcomes him, and he knights Arthur and submits.
I'd just say another brilliant scene for me as a parent was the scene between Mordred and Arthur, when Mordred confronts Arthur, and there's an example of a broken parental relationship. There's no relationship, and Mordred's angry. He's a teenager. He's full of hate and tears, but also I sensed like there was a kind of a need for love as well there. And Arthur says, "Well, I cannot give you the kingdom. All I can give you is my love." And Mordred, of course, retaliates in a very teenage way. "Well, that's the one thing I don't want, Dad." I thought that was wonderful. Beautifully played. The actor who played Mordred, Robert Addy, he also died when he was very young. I think he was only in his mid-40s. Mordred's spectacular. The elder Mordred in the film is absolutely spectacular with the gold armor. But I always thought that scene was really poignant as you know, he's been raised by his mother, who's full of hate. Morgana hates Arthur, has hated him right from the beginning. I thought that scene was beautiful because I think the actor Robert Addy really did manage to convey the conflict that the character felt of, well, this is his father and there is perhaps a need for love here, but there can be no redemption. It's very beautiful scene.
Well, also very interesting that both of them were children of deceit. You know, that Arthur, you know, his existence came from an act of deceit and desecration, and also Mordred as well. You know, and I always thought that was sort of a quite interesting idea, and the sense that you know, perhaps because of this origin, you know, I mean, you would expect in the sort of in a kind of mythos like this that it would render him you know, imperfect, you know, that he would not be up to the task, because again his very foundation was built upon a kind of version of right and good. I always wondered what, you know, this was sort of hinted at. I don't think Boorman didn't seem to make a big issue of it, but it may have gotten lost in the, you know, in the noise. But quite a curious aspect of this, and the kind of relationship between, you know, between these two men, you know, who issued the magic of the sea.
Yeah, and of course, Mordred the Younger is played by Charlie Boorman, he of the motorcycling fame. He's the one that goes on these god-awful motorcycling trips with Ewan McGregor, and off they go into the distance together. So yeah.
Well, also where the Igraine was also played by
his daughter,
Boorman's daughter. You know, I mean, just thinking of the discomfort of filming that scene with her and Uther.
Yeah, just
not
a
choice
normal
I would have
day.
made for my not a choice I would have made for my daughter, but.
Well, it's very awkward because Boorman did commentary on the film for like the DVDs, and I was reading about when he gets to that section, and he just suddenly gets very, very awkward and nervous, and you know, starts talking about everything else apart from what's happening on screen. You know, and it's just like, you know, you could tell he's regretting immediately why, you know, casting his daughter in that role. It's a very strange thing, but then I mean, perhaps that in itself, the very unnaturalness is being that he's feeling is conveyed to us in the movie itself. So perhaps he would, you know, in some weird way, it actually has more power as a consequence to it.
Some odd form of instead of method acting, it's method directing.
Method directing, yeah, I like it. But yeah, I think I think Mr. D, one thing that Boorman says, you know, in connection with this kind of strange relationship as well, is that it's really a story of civilization for him. The Excalibur movie, that about a rise and a fall of a civilization, and there could be a sense in which, and he says the movie itself. The end of the movie is where we're at. We're at that point in the story, and so there could be a sense in which the very origins of a civilization bring about its own downfall. And of course, this is something that we see in Wagner's Ring cycle with the ring and Wotan taking the spear from the ash tree, leading. You know, it's based on a power which ultimately will end up devouring itself. So there could be a sense in which he's suggesting that all civilizations have this kind of propensity towards their own destruction. Who needs Prophets of Doom, right? You could just watch Excalibur; it's all there.
Indeed, I mean, it's very much, of course. I think also not a coincidence that the 70s sort of gave birth to a lot of films, a lot of works of art that started to really be interested or explore this idea of degradation and decay. And I do think that there is a sense in Excalibur that it is the sort of story of what happened to Britain by the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 1980s. You know, I don't think that probably was lost on people. You know, and I do think that I mean, obviously, all works of art are going to be in some sense a product of their time, and there is a very I mean, it's certainly a film from that period, and just in the sort of the sort of countenance of various people and the kind of ethos on display. But I do think it is very interesting to explore that idea, and that you say that Boorman said very consciously that it's a story of the civilization, sort of life and death of civilization. Because I do think it was sort of the 70s were, for a lot of people, a kind of moment like that, where they sort of, there began to be this pervasive perception that the good fertile days were behind us.
There's an interesting line we were talking about before the stream, comparisons to Eliot, and listening to you, Mr. D, there, it brings to me the lines from East Coker. In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field, or a factory, or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur, and feces, bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. That's that end of the 70s. You think of wrecking balls, old buildings being smashed, wastelands of a kind opening up in the towns and in the society. And the parable in the film, of course, is you seek for the grail. You have the moment of healing. You also, at the same time, have this poignancy, this awareness of this loss. And this is coming to this theme of absence for me, about why Arthur is still so powerful. What it is, postmodern leftists would call this hauntological. And this is quite an interesting and useful concept of the post-Marxist left. It's the intrusion and resonance of the past, breaking into the fabric of the time that we're in. And it's often used by leftists when they talk about hauntology to describe a mourning for a sense of a future that was promised but never arrived. And that's precisely what you have with the Arthur myth, the compact to return from Avalon in the time of the country's greatest need, at this moment where, as you say, we're perceiving it, that weakening, that breaking of the kingly spirit, if you like, in the post-war, is why it still sort of sears us, because it's that the imaginative power comes from our awareness of its absence, if you like, and the anticipation that it might come back is the thing that compels us to it.
Very interesting point. And of course, that this presents itself as a cycle. That Excalibur is returned, but that again, it may one day make its way back into the hands of men again.
Well, Arthur, even in the film itself, Arthur has these lines which I think really speak to what you've just said. It's almost on the nose with it. The fellowship was a brief beginning, a fair time that cannot be forgotten, and because it will not be forgotten, that fair time may come again. Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be. So I think very much, Simon, that sense of this memory has power in itself, and of something which maybe was, but hasn't been yet, but could be again, is the thing which allures us to it. It's almost that. I'm almost tempted to think of it in terms of like how Dante saw Beatrice. It's this mediation towards something beyond, towards the transcendent in a way. It's the image or the symbol which brings that to us. And chasing after that is the way up the ladder, as it were. Yeah.
It's the ethereality that persists. It's the what I was struck by things when you look at other parts of the Arthur lore. You look at things like there is the thing called the Stanzas of the Graves, which is in the Black Book of Carmarthen, which is a lot of Welsh Arthurian lore, which is some of the earliest Welsh manuscript ever from the 13th century. And there's a few lines, just a brief allusion to Arthur, and I found it in the Welsh, and I'm going to try and pronounce it properly. But the lines are "Be di mach, be di gweithiwr, be di gainglaith a noith bid be di Arthur," and this is a grave for Mark, a grave for Gwythor, a grave for Gagaun Red Sword, but the grave of Arthur will not be known. So you can never quite reach or touch the hero. They're always in this other world, this dream time. And you've got in Malory where he says, and many men say that King Arthur is not dead and that he shall come again. For upon his tomb is written this verse: Hic jacet Arthurus, rex quondam rex quae futurus. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king.
Yeah, famous line, and obviously then you get sort of this allusion to, to Christ, and as the Son, the sort of incarnation of the Spirit of God, and sort of embodied in the hero. The idea that the hero is, came as part of this cycle and left again, but left as a kind of primal spirit that of course is undying, and then that may be embodied again, in some future coming to the land. So yeah, very, very clear, and it is very interesting how the Arthurian mythos is very much sort of entangled also with kind of beginnings of seeds of Christianity in the British Isles.
You've got those lines in the Anglo-Saxon poem The Rood, this poem that's told from the point of view of the cross on which Christ is set. And there's a bit towards the end of it where the tree, the cross, is talking about when they took the body down. And it says, they set to contrive him a tomb within the sight of the tree of death, laid in it the bringer of victory, spent from the great struggle. So they conceived of Christ as like an epic hero figure.
I think in this regard, actually, there's a medieval chronicler. He's anonymous, unfortunately, but he says that for the Bretons and I think the Welsh to some extent, they treated Arthur like the Jews treat their Messiah, that he will return again and build the kingdom of God on earth, essentially. And it was also reported that if you ever said to a Breton that Arthur was not returning, you would be lucky not to be stoned by them. They were that fierce about their belief in Arthur's return. So at that time, it wasn't just a metaphor for somebody else returning, or a nice picture of political cycles. There was a real kind of messianic dimension to Arthur that carries over. So even if you have kind of cycles of history, ideas and wheels of fortune, and so on, that it's still this idea that actually Arthur doesn't just kind of repeat the cycle. It's there's a golden age as part of it that he brings with him, and although it's only temporary in the life of of human civilizations, it's still a tangible possibility. That kind of existence, it was once there, and it could be again. And as you were saying, alludes or foreshadows the once and for all golden age that Christ brings himself,
and puts, strangely enough, puts in mind the verse from Matthew. Do not think that I have come to bring peace. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. And it very directly makes me think of it. Christ bearing Excalibur in a sort of blending of mystic visions.
That's a painting somebody needs to do.
Yeah, it does seem like there's some basis for that.
Well, maybe we should turn to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. We can always comment on Excalibur if we will, but I think maybe this is a good point to pivot. And so this was made, as you were saying, Simon, in 1975, 1 year after Lancelot de Lac. And it was Monty Python's first feature film. They had made one film before, but I think it was a series of sketches, essentially in the same vein as
right.
the TV.
Yes.
But this was the first time, and was it Terry Jones and
Gilliam?
Terry Gilliam? Yeah,
Terry Gilliam and I think Gilliam and Jones shared the directing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mainly Gilliam.
Because they'd been very dissatisfied with people like, I think, Ian McNaughton, who'd done the TV show. They were constantly wanting to suggest stuff, and this time they got funding from was it Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd?
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, the guy from there's just a number of these kind of progressive type group music
George
groups.
Harrison as well.
Yeah, George Harrison. It was just for a tax write-off for these groups. You know, the top rate of tax then was 90% for these groups, so you might as well just write it off. Yeah.
It was
Jethro Tull. That's it.
Oh, was it Ian Anderson?
Yeah, Ian. Yes, Ian. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it came to me eventually.
Puts in mind that Harrison funded Withnail and I as well.
Did indeed, yeah.
Handmade films, yeah.
Yeah, and
handmade films.
One of the only films to have permission to use the Beatles songs in the soundtrack without paying for it. And I believe Terry Jones directed the following Python film as well. I know that he directed Meaning of Life. Terry Gilliam directed the short
Crimson Permanent Assurance.
Crimson Permanent Assurance.
That's my favourite Terry Gilliam film, actually, I have to say.
It's very good.
Yeah. The interesting thing about this was that they'd started to be able to impose a bit more will on their vision, and there was always a division within the Pythons between the Oxford types like Palin and Jones, who wanted to do more history-based kind of atmospheric stuff, and the people who wanted to do Cleese and Chapman and Idle, who were much keener on the sort of wordplay and the surrealist aspects of it, and Gilliam, who had his kind of weird. I mean, the interesting thing about this, as I don't know if you noticed, Mr. D, there are various sort of visual cues. Even in the first shots of the film, you have a Arthur coming over the hill in the mist, and you have a man broken on a wheel.
Yeah,
and it looks like a detail from Bruegel's Triumph of Death, and you can tell there's other sort of Bruegelian. Gilliam likes this kind of layered mise en scène with lots of busyness, like a Bruegel painting.
And I will say for a comedy film and for a film with a very limited budget, there are actually some really interesting and occasionally even beautiful visual moments in that film, which I of course had entirely forgotten. But rewatching it, I mean, there are certainly a few moments of quite decent cinematography. There's one scene where they're going through I can't remember where they were going. It may have been right before they met the Knights Who Say Me, but it's absolutely beautiful photography, which is just a bit odd to think about in this context.
That is nice though.
I was just going to say beautiful. Dee said beautiful locations. Or filmed in Glencoe, then filmed at Stalker Castle, which later came to be heavily in Highlander, the 1986 film. Also Castle, just beautiful locations. So they made the most of the landscape that they had to work with. They had no money.
Simon, you were going to say something there.
Yes, I was just going to. I mean, I think the interesting conceit about it, as I said at the beginning, is this is very much a vision of chivalry, of the heroic being interrupted and frustrated all the time, and it really sort of shows from the first moments where you have the heavy, portentous music, and then you've got the comedy going on with the Swedish subtitles, and you're immediately disrupting the atmosphere of reverence for myth. Where people are sort of manfully persisting to try and fill their roles in the heroic. I mean, Graham Chapman as Arthur is trying to kind of follow a script in a way, to be the chivalric, the sturdy, noble king, and everybody else is undermining him. There's a sort of series of encounters of sort of annoying peasants and knights in the woods who is more or less treating the king as a kind of it's like a bureaucracy in a way. All these other people are constantly looking down on him or regarding him as unimportant. There's no magic about a king. There's this sort of the Bolshoi peasants in the field piling up mud, just pointless, a sort of pointless economy. And at the same time, you've got this sort of the three-headed knight who's just sort of arguing with himself, and Arthur's constantly trying to sort of pass these sort of crappy obstacles, really, in the pursuance of his quest, and he's sort of frustrated by it, but he's trying not to be diminished as well. But it's interesting the way it's shot, that from the very off, you see that Arthur, they shoot down from the castle battlements down onto him. He looks small, and it's the soldiers on the battlements who are in power. They are controlling things. They have no interest. They're not charmed by the legend at all. So he's always sort of put on the back foot in this way, and the attempts to behave in the chivalric mold are sort of beset by idiocy that he encounters.
Oh, definitely. Sorry, I was just going to say the constitutional peasants are fantastic. That's one of my favourite scenes. And the absolute cheek of them, they say to him, "How did you get to be king?" And it's absolutely, it's wonderful. I didn't vote for you.
Strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. The whole film, Simon, does remind me. There's a at the end of one of their television sketches, like. Was it the cheese shop sketch? And the sort of like penultimate line before like he's shot is, I was deliberately wasting your time.
Yeah.
And the whole film seems to be a whole series of just pointless things. The tortured logic of the witch, a witch and a duck in a piece of wood, and you've got to get us a shrubbery, and we're going to put it here in the forest with a little fence around it. I mean, it's just, you're right. It's just this just ridiculous meaninglessness. Constantly frustrating. This king who was never able to fully embody this mythical figure. Because everything around him is designed to kind of frustrate it. In a way, a weird sort of allegory for, I think, the kind how these ancient stories, how they would filter through the kind of curse of modernity.
Yeah.
And of course, the end of the film, where the entire thing is just procedurally snuffed out by
police.
by police, and then it just goes dark. That's not something that we should probably mention, is that I do believe that the various Pythons were quite satisfied with the way that they ended the film, but they really couldn't think of another way to do it. There apparently was some other ending that they had written, but they ended up just having to just kind of do it that way, which is an absolute anticlimax. It's a very postmodern film in its way.
And that's another element of the poignancy I was talking about with the absence in the King Arthur myth. That, as you say, when I was a kid watching that film, and I loved it. I loved the atmosphere of it, and to be honest, I was sort of the sort of kid who played knights with my friends and wanted to go on quests imaginatively, and the thing where the police come in and arrest them all, I was always heartbroken.
Yeah,
that they don't get to complete the quest, and that's the element of the Arthur myth that persists. That it's you always feel the myth most in the moment of its loss, when it's the ending. In the very white heat of the glorious moment that it's frustrated or taken away from you. And that's that moment in the film in particular, because Arthur's finally resolved, and it's kind of quite magnificent the way that they do the montage of the army forming up, and Graham Chapman really committed to it as an actor, especially at the time when he's in the throes of alcoholism.
He really had to work hard at it.
You actually see he's actually very good actor. I mean, there's actually lots of examples of very good acting in the film, comic acting, and stuff that, if you look at the TV shows, it was a bit sloppy. Actually, I've been rewatching the Flying Circus stuff from the beginning, and there was acting that was just rubbish at times. But by this point, they've gone through all of that, and they are holding it up and not winking at the camera or messing around. They are doing their bit for each of the parts that are written. And Terry Jones as Prince Herbert, I mean, there's a little bit of sort of physical comedy acting where he's writing the note that he's attaching to the arrow that he's firing out the window, and he does this kind of stiff little kind of maneuver to try and not alert the guards who are just smiling benignly at him.
He's just smiling at him.
So there's actually some masterful stuff, and I think when they always said that, they always thought Graham Chapman was the best actor of the Pythons, I could actually see it, because when I watched the film again, like you say, Mr. D, there were moments of kind of lambent beauty with light shafts falling through the forest, and beautiful layering. I think probably a lot of Gilliam influence there, throwing a bit of smoke into the background to accentuate the depth of field, and odd little funny shots. I think he's got one shot when they meet Tim the Enchanter, and he's actually placed a skull right next to the camera.
Yeah.
So they appear to be walking out of the eye socket of the skull. There's very sort of Hieronymus Bosch kind of looking moment of a sort of body part, blown up in the screen. And there's visually actually a lot to sort of recommend it. There's parts where it is more sketch-like, but there's actually just a lot of unintended, perhaps intended beauty in it. That again adds to that sort of poignancy. There's an interview that a clip that went round back in April that we commented on at the time, with Terry Jones being interviewed, and him being Terry Wogan quipping that he was perhaps a bit of a reactionary, and there was debate about whether this was a sincere statement. But there is a sort of both a love for the period and a desire to disrupt it as well, as a kind of facet of modernity, as a kind of, you wouldn't be permitted to go on a quest in this world. There's too many forms to be filled in. There's too many permissions to be had. You've got the police, that sort of grubbiness of modern life.
Well, I actually have the clip here, so let's watch it so we can see what Jones says himself, because I think it really speaks to that.
And you said the only snag is that the entire population of medieval London is going to be killed or injured on the roads every year. That's the only trouble. There's going to be 30 or 40,000 people. You'd think twice about living in this day and age.
Well, that's true. That is true. But I mean, the sanitation and all, you've grown used to loos and cleanliness. And I mean, you have all your own teeth, I can see. But I mean, it was a bit...
Except for this one, that's somebody else on there, yeah.
You're bringing it in for somebody else. Yeah. It was a bit squalid, though, wasn't it?
Well, I think it was probably less squalid than we imagine. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be all shiny plastic surfaces and things like that. But I think that people had to live, and they did have concepts of health. I think we have a very kind of... I think we were brought up to believe in progress, and this idea that we're living on this this increasing line where everything's getting better and better all the time. And I don't think things are, really. I mean, you just take something like medicine.
You're a reactionary, aren't you, really?
I am, yes, you're right, Harry, I am.
Marching backwards, that's the way you want to go.
Well, no, I think things sort of move around. I think what is important to find out what was good about the Middle Ages and about the past, and to learn from the past, and not to have not to live in this kind of cloud cuckoo land where we think everything is improving.
Well, you're not all that keen on progress, are you?
Well, I don't believe it's happening, that's the thing. I think we're kidding ourselves a lot of the time. And I think it's something like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. In a way, it looked convincing to us because it made the Middle Ages look so dirty, because it's kind of pandering to our kind of inflated view of how we're living now.
Well, one thing that really struck me just with that, and I'll let you come in a moment, Mr. D, is just the the similarities between Boorman and Jones's view of history. Actually, is the cyclical view, and both of them have this underlying vision of the future. It doesn't always get better. Progress isn't the case, and actually, in many ways, we're probably just as bad, if not worse, than those folks who were living all that time ago.
Yeah, very good point. And of course, I mean, Jones could be saying this back then, is quite revelatory, because I mean, one of the things that I noted, watching it, of course, is the Holy Grail does present this pervasive idea. I mean, everyone is just absolutely covered in muck, I mean, there's that moment where they're like, how do you know he's the king? Well, he's the only one who's not covered in shit. But of course, this just isn't true. We know this isn't true. I mean, obviously, there were different ways of organizing, the necessities of daily life. But I mean, people obviously, certain, depending on what type of person you're talking about, they would have a very limited range of clothing and stuff. They weren't, people didn't walk around covered in shit. It didn't work that way. I mean, and as Jones said, I mean, there were standards of health. There was a type of medicine. I mean, obviously, effectiveness is up in the air, but again, these were not. We have this stupid, one of the stupid ideas of kind of progressive modernity is just the idea that there is a progress, that we're making some sort of linear journey from down to up, that we're building an ever more technical ladder that's going to reach heaven at some point, reach some point of digital materialist transcendence, which is just nonsense, and I think people in our sort of proximate circles, and this is a large concern. I think a lot of people I know erroneously dismiss Monty Python as being, they caused, that they're the reason that everyone in Britain became so cynical about their own traditions, their own culture, whatever. No, it was an absolutely ridiculous thing to say. I mean, they were certainly expressing, the kind of condition of the culture of their time. Things were already broken, things were already falling apart. People were already simple, and I think they reflected this. And I do always sort of push back against this idea that there's just a tendency to say, well, it's all the fault of the boomers, and of course Monty Python, they're big boomer heroes, and they are the ones. It was John Cleese who wrecked society. I'm afraid it wasn't. I'm afraid society was already wrecked, and John Cleese was just along for the ride. So I do think it is something that you see, and for some reason Monty Python seems to be singled out. Often referenced, as a kind of cause of our decline.
This is interesting. I was hoping you would talk about this, Mr. D. There's always this interesting question about art and creativity, and I mean, and I follow, I follow people I'm interested in culturally, and a lot of them are very left wing. They would absolutely hate my views, and I'm always interested in our tension with culture and art, and about how we feel that subversion is engendered by art. I'm someone for whom it doesn't have a force that derails my, let's say my political view or my social view, but I'm concerned that people feel threatened by enjoying something, which may come from. I mean, as you say, this idea that they are responsible for this deeply corrosive subversion. I mean, to try and represent it fairly, there were people around debating this and saying, well, yes, they had this attitude towards Christianity, and it within the group itself, it varies. There were people who were somewhat more emphatic. People like Eric Idle, for example. He was always had a great problem with authority. He was always wanting to, to kick back against the headmaster. Whereas people like Michael Palin were a bit more, well, these people were basically benign and they were just trying to bring us up and do their best. So I'm interested in this idea of how should we, how do we get people to stop worrying about the idea that art is controlling their minds and their society in some way? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I would say that I would say that it's mixed, because I do think, as being I suppose somewhat elitist. I don't think that art is necessarily for everyone, nor should it be, because I do think that there are a lot of people who are just not in the position to have the defenses against these things. I mean, it's easy for men and ladies such as the likes of the exalted likes of us, to be able to to deal with it. I mean, this is very kind of very sort of Victorian thing, where you would have a book and any sort of like untoward passages, they would render them in Latin because then only a kind of person who had read Latin would understand it, and of course that would be a person who was not going to get their jollies from whatever little bit of filth that they were printing. And so it is this idea. I do think that art is powerful, and I do think that it can, of course, influence people in both good and bad ways. I think it is somewhat ambiguous. This was of course something, a big part of Kubrick's Clockwork Orange, that there's this absolutely beastly thug loved to listen to Beethoven, but Beethoven did not elevate his mind. It did not elevate his morals. It did not make him a better person. This idea that art is not necessarily a kind of panacea, a prescription for moral, degradation, the improvement of moral degradation or whatever. So I do think you've got to be careful. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying that again, the influence of a huge cultural force like Monty Python at the time, again, they were reflecting their kind of frustrations and interpretations of the culture. But again, how people receive that is another matter. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they were approximately responsible for making people cynical about the church, cynical about traditional culture. But I think that foul work had already been done, and I think that the cynicism that, in a way, that you see in some of the Python's work, it was a reaction to what had already been desecrated. So.
Sorry, lady. Did you want to come in there?
No, I think it's a great discussion, and it raises a real questions. I mean, I remember after the 1990 World Cup, there was a craze in Britain for listening to opera because of Nessun Dorma, which was sung by the Three Tenors at a concert in Rome just prior to the World Cup final in 1990. It was a massive thing. And you'd see quite sort of working class people listening to tapes of Pavarotti. Well, did that make them any better? Sure. Did that really lift them up and enlighten them and spiritually and culturally aware? I'm not sure about that. So it's interesting, isn't it? I do remember that seemed to, it was everywhere in that summer of 1990. But did it really? Did it change the people that put it on the cassette and shoved it into the car to listen to it? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, it's just like natural beauty, of course we're surrounded by beauty. It's all over the place. Even in sort of the most miserable places, there's still patches of things that are beautiful. But and yet it takes it depends upon the spirit of the person to be able to receive what is given. It's the same with the church. You can attend church, you can walk through church, you can read religious texts all you like, but if your spirit is not ready to receive that gift, then you won't take it. It won't catch hold in your soul. You can walk through an art museum and look at the treasures of the ages and be absolutely unmoved. I see it all the time. For instance, is one of the reasons I don't think I think it should be voluntary when they make school trips, because I see miserable children being dragged in front of all of these wonders, and it has no effect whatsoever. The person must be receptive to it. So sorry if I'm caused us to stray so much from Monty Python, but I think it's something that comes up.
It's totally relevant because it's one of the questions that people ask, and there was a big debate when I posted that Terry Jones clip initially on Twitter about Monty Python and its role in culture and potentially discrediting some of these religious ideas and myths in wider culture. And I definitely think that there is a power that, I mean, last year before Wagner Day, Misty, we spoke about art as having a magical quality that could kind of reach into you, be below consciousness to some degree, and shape you. But I think you're also right that it also depends on the spirit. And I kind of wrestle with this because on the one hand, I think, if you look at the Arthurian tradition, one thing that's often ignored that is actually really important is there are a number of medieval texts which are quite comical and which do make fun of Arthur at various points. I think of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Arthur doesn't turn out very well in that story. He comes across as a little bit cowardly, a little bit pompous, and has lost touch with what's important. And it's Gawain who's the real hero of that story. It's comic, and the medievals had an embrace of the comic in a way that we maybe don't think of. So I don't think in that respect. I think in that respect you could see this tale with somebody like Terry Jones, who would go on to produce his own TV documentary on the medieval era, as being kind of consistent with that. On the other hand, though, I think when you put forward ideas or sentiments, in a way, when what we engage with opens the possibilities up for certain kinds of behavior and action which maybe weren't there before, or at least they were not able to manifest so readily. But once a work of art or a set of concepts or emotions are kind of uttered into existence, it plants that within a culture and thus becomes something which shapes the behaviors of many. So that even if you've got somebody like Jones who's very sympathetic to the medieval and King Arthur, those who watch it, the possibilities of kind of being very rude about monarchy are suddenly exacerbated tenfold in a way that they wouldn't have been before. So I can see a real tension with it.
One point I wanted to make before I forget: someone in the chat can read my mind, because they just posted it. They mentioned marginalia in medieval manuscripts, in folios, and if you've ever looked through any sort of, well, not any, but a lot of work from this period. So, and the funny thing, of course, is that Terry Gilliam, in his animations and his titles and such for Holy Grail, he was obviously aware of it, and he made reference to it. For instance, there is that little sequence where you've got the sort of the angels, and there's a moment where there's this row of figures with trumpets in their asses, playing the trumpet with their ass, and you say, well, that's just nasty modern things. No, there are literally medieval marginalia of people playing trumpets with their ass. Also, of course, in paintings, we mentioned we mentioned Hieronymus Bosch. I mean, some of those pictures are just a cavalcade of absolutely surreal and darkly hilarious things. But you can look, and if you just Google medieval marginalia, you will see you will see rabbits dressed as knights having a battle. You will see monkeys trotting on a crown. I mean, there is all sorts of wacky, irreverent stuff in those, and in fact, I do think that we suffer from being kind of post-Victorians, in that we have this very artificial, dry sense of propriety, when the actual history of that period was quite bawdy. I mean, read the Canterbury Tales. There's a lot of very broad, very, very, what certainly your average Victorian would call crude. Another work from that period is Rabelais, Gargantua and Pantagruel. I mean, absolute filth in that book, and hilarity. There's absolutely hilarious moments. So, in a weird way, I think that some of the humor, certainly some of the visual humor in Monty Python and Holy Grail, is very medieval, in its character. This is the sort of thing that people would, that people of all strata would enjoy, and it wasn't just the peasants who liked this kind of bawdy thing, it was a popular entertainment. So it is I think an important point to make.
And it's an anxiety of our age, isn't it? That with our desire, perhaps if we're very politically activated, let's say, to see that there's a conformance in the culture that we consume with some agenda, if you like, or some sort of direction of travel that we feel is moral. But I don't view art or culture that way myself. As I say, I enjoy things that are made by people I would never agree with me, but I repurpose it in my mind as I observe it, as I engage with it. so that there isn't a feeling of a danger about that somehow, leading to a miserable, subverted world. You can't demand art, conform in that way. You just make bad art in the end. You just make propaganda if you try to always. I always remember that a few years ago the gnashings about Morrissey, for example, when the liberal left sort of felt, oh, he's escaped our clutches now, I'm going to burn all my Smiths records. And there was this sort of weird tantrum reaction that people couldn't be at all. They were completely graceless about it.
Yeah, they feel they have this ownership of Morrissey, and he has disappointed them in some way, the way that a naughty child would disappoint you. It's just such a terrible way to think.
I just wanted to reference some of the medieval humor bits within the film that might jump out as us. You've already mentioned the kind of muckiness and so on. I just showed a picture of manuscripts of rabbits attacking a priest. Well, one can't help but think of the killer rabbit, right? The bunny that the knights think, oh yeah, this is a cute little bunny, and it devastates the whole troop, and they have to run away. You also have the peasant communists. So if you've seen Terry Jones's documentary on the medieval era, and I'd recommend it, he talks about the peasants, and he goes on at length about how actually most of the time they lived pretty independently of the Lord. They had their own baronial manor courts, and they would run things together, and they would actually elect somebody for the year to run the system. So actually, this is a joke, kind of joking at us about our preconceptions about how peasants related to their lords. And he even says, like, oh, the Lord would probably be away fighting half the time, or drinking or something. He wouldn't be bothering with them, so they probably wouldn't even know who's up in the castle half the time. So this is something which we take for granted as being a certain way, but actually the film is much closer to the reality and kind of makes humor out of that.
And this is something our friend Academic Agent has referenced in his 1381 John Bull essay, where he describes the actual number of holidays they had each year and the relative latitude of freedom that they enjoyed. It's not to say that it was all a bed of roses, but the point being was that his point was that the modern mind couldn't conceive of a history where people weren't being oppressed. A constant Marxist reading of history, that you felt that, okay, there were rebellions in the Middle Ages, there were discontents, but in the frequency that these happened relative to people's lives, it wouldn't have been sustainable, let's say, to have people would have had to find ways to rub along. They would have had to find ways to bring in the harvest, to work with the Lord, and to gain the benefits of the noblesse oblige of the Lord as well. So there would have had to be some sort of synergistic relationship, to use a sort of terrible corporate modern word, that meant that people, you couldn't constantly be sort of wanting to sort of knock over the whole system. It just wouldn't have been practical. People had to sort of live in a way that perhaps maybe is more a hierarchical society, that people did, as it were, work in their place and know their place, but that's because that's how it worked best. And so the need to subvert it and throw it. I mean, the comments we've been talking about art as well, there's a balance with the sacred and the profane, and making those work without them threatening to kind of completely tip over your world.
Well, and you could say as well, like, if you look at the end of the film and kind of bringing it back to what we were saying earlier, what happens? They literally have to lock away the past, this dangerous past, which, there's this interesting bit which we haven't spoken about yet. There's this historian giving a very kind of dry documentary about, the medieval England, and a knight rides past. It's the only horse we actually see in the film.
Yeah, the only horse.
and he just takes his sword and swipes the professor, and he's just bleeding out, and his poor wife runs on, and it's tragic. And then later on we see the wife giving a kind of description to a policeman, who, you know, with his notepad. And then at the very end of the film, when things are just about to break out, when we're just about to have the battle to try and take the Holy Grail, when the medieval and the myth are really about to burst through, it's arrested and it's put away. And I can't help but feel about this being a kind of message of, or actually, if we actually dealt with the history, if we actually dealt with the mythology, if we allowed it to break out, it would really change us. But we're not allowed to in this kind of bureaucratic, progressive world. And I'm almost reminded as well, and I think this was a take that Morgoth gave of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, because, you know, we see in the film the Ark is the Ark of the Covenant. It has power. It melts faces when people look at it. So it's real. It's supernatural. But what do the American government do? Well, at the end of the film, we see it locked away in a warehouse somewhere secret that nobody will ever find it again. It's counterintuitive, but that's the end point for the kind of modern technocratic state dealing with the supernatural or history, is to try and file it away and never let it out again.
Very well put.
Yes.
Yeah, there's something quite haunting about that in a way. I've had the pleasure many times of walking through museum stores, which is really, really quite an experience, you know, because there is I always got a very strange sense that, you know, I mean, you know, if it's a painting store, there are these literal just dozens and dozens and dozens of these sort of racks which slide in and out, big, almost like a big filing system. They're kind of almost like pieces of fencing, and just on both sides of them are all of these, the artistic legacy of the world, you know, all of these paintings by, you know, famous hands, you know, languishing in the dark in these roads, or these file drawers full of, you know, I mean, ancient talismans. You know, I once was with a curator in a musical instrument museum, and you know, just this immense room full of these cabinets. And, you know, took me over to one of many anonymous cabinets and pulled it open. There was this extraordinary kind of whistle. You know, what is that? He's like, well, it's an Aztec death whistle, which was sounded as part of a kind of sacrificial ceremony. And it is in this like cotton wool, in this metal drawer, you know. So there is something kind of strange about this, you know, that it is again our kind of post-Victorian obsession that everything must be sort of, all of this mythic power and magic of the past is got to be sort of regimented and locked away. I mean, it is sort of the appearance of that historian, you know, it's because you're in the midst of a kind of living, I mean, even though it's of course a ridiculous farce, but you're in the middle of kind of living sort of world of, you know, of the ostensible Middle Ages in England, and yet it's suddenly intruded upon by a person who is telling you, like, and framing what you're seeing, you know, basically reducing the kind of, you know, the sort of sense of vitality that you get by making a film, a period film. Here's a person coming in to kind of frame it and deaden it, you know. And then, of course, hilariously, you get a knight who slashes him open. You know, you get this great visceral moment that you know that where his intrusion in that world is met with the intrusion of that world dealing with him in their own way. And you know, even though it's played for comedy, I think there's something quite profound about that. You know, I just there's always this sense that you know. Well, even in the Crimson Permanent Assurance, you know, it's this. I mean, this obsession, and certainly Terry Gilliam, you see it in Brazil as well. The idea of human life and human vitality being drowned in bureaucratic nonsense. You know, literally being smothered by forms and paperwork. You know, just mounds of it piling up and choking all the life out of everything. And so it is a sort of I do think a kind of curse of the way we think of everything. We don't allow these tales to be visceral. We you know, everything has to be contextualized. Everything has to be filed away. and you know, sometimes, you know, you want it to scream to life.
And it has to be captured in a sort of frame of interpretation, doesn't it? This is a line in Excalibur actually that makes me think about this. That Arthur asks Merlin, "What's the most important quality of knighthood?" And he says, "Truth." You know, so in a sense, we've always got this challenge with myth. You know, it remains ethereal. It lives in ideals. It lives in dreams. That theme again that recurs through Excalibur. It's a dream that I have, a dream to some, a nightmare for others. It's a time for men and their dreams. And I think part of what we're looking for with myths like this is our ability to generate a recrudescence of power in culture and place at the same time. And what you have with Arthur is it's a sort of challenge to counter the absence that we see in our world around us, because we know we don't have an Arthur, but we sort of see it in the gaps around us, in the trees, in the stones, in the environments that we move through, and we ourselves kind of need to connect with a sort of dream time of our own in order to engage with that source of power that is meshed in these films. The King and the Land are one, and you know, the sword, and these unifying ideas that come through in order to reach this place of truth. It's will and power meeting in a place.
I think that's beautifully put. And before I build on it, I just have this this urge that I really want a knight to run up behind me and slash me now, so that the spirit breaks forth on the stream.
Me too.
I'm always waiting for a knight to run up behind me.
That thing I was saying about culture there, about it's about, again, going back to the Excalibur thing, the charm of making. And this is perhaps answers the question a lot of people are desperate for right now. Where do we go? What do we do? We have to start making things. I mean, think of things like fragments of history like Alfred's jewel, you know, found at his camp near Athelney, you know, from where he launched his retaliation against the Viking invaders. And what's written on the jewel in Anglo-Saxon? Alfred meg het gewelken. Alfred had me made.
Oh. Amazing.
I was wondering as well, actually, you know, one of the things that's missing from the medieval era is this very unified sense of calendar, of time, in which you have feasts, you have fasts, there's periods for certain attitudes, there's periods for others. And I was thinking about the lords of misrule, or the boy bishops, you know, in the Christmas season, the 12 days of Christmas, merrymaking, that this is a period when kind of chaos can reign, and you have a lord of misrule, probably somebody who's low on the social hierarchy, elevated to this ruling position, but kind of oversees a number of comedic festivities. There's feasting, you know, the lords have to serve the servants and so on, and this all reaches a climax on the 12th day of Christmas, and so on. And then this is almost like a cathartic thing before we return to the established order, and it almost reaffirms it in some way. And so when you were talking about hauntology, Simon, and kind of bringing it back there, I'm almost wondering if in a strange way these films are like we stand in an inverse relation to that. In some ways, our culture is a misrule culture in many respects, about overturning hierarchies and so on, but we need a kind of release back into the old natural order.
These are our English or British hauntologies, these films, in a sense, these myths, these protrusions from the past that are trying to sort of, you know, capture our attention again. As I say, it's always that moment of poignancy of realizing you can make it real, you can make something from this, or you can leave it. It's, again, I go back to Eliot, you know, what we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from.
Well, I think that's a good point just to ask then, because we're drawing towards the end of this stream, is that, you know, I'll ask each of you in turn to maybe just give some final thoughts on these two films, and We'll maybe go in reverse order. So, Mr. D, would you like to kick us off with some final concluding thoughts on these films?
Well, it was very interesting to watch them again after so many years. As I said before we started, again, speaking about sort of magic and sort of being able to be captured by a kind of by art and transported. I had a much different. I had a very similar reaction to Mr. Roberts when I saw Holy Grail, which came out very near the year I was born as well. But I as a child, I was. Obviously, again, a comedy. Well, I wasn't a child. I was slightly older. It's as a comedy film, but also I was sort of drawn into it. It is atmospheric enough, and it does have a lot of these sort of qualities and threads that I very much admired as a young person. But again, I now as a man approaching my declining years, I am unable to connect with it in the way that I used to, and of course it's always slightly disappointing. I do think it's sometimes dangerous to revisit things, that were magical to you, that were kind of integral to the way you thought about things. But again, talking about it with you, with panel, and actually made me sort of reappreciate the game, because I was sort of spurred to think about, and again think more deeply about what was happening in that film, and so yeah, I do have a renewed appreciation, as with Excalibur. As I said, I still consider it quite a flawed film in a lot of ways, but yet I think that there is a kind of even a sort of vestigial heroism that transfers to the likes of John Borman and the people who made that film. It was a kind of heroic effort to tell that story in that way, and even if it is not by certain metrics the most successful outcome, I do think there is a certain magic in it. And I will say the other thing about Excalibur that I sort of failed to mention is that it's resolutely, in a way, it sort of sets itself against these kind of easily definable narrative expectations. I think a lot of the power of it comes from things that should be powerful in cinema, which are images, which are kind of the blend of image and sound, the kind of things that are beyond arrangement, beyond sort of language, in a way, because that's what a film is meant to be. It's not just a kind of essay. It's not just the sort of words on a page. It's also a collection of images and sounds and all sorts of, it's a sort of amalgamation of so many arts into one Gesamtkunstwerk, if that's the correct term. I'm sort of drawn back to Wagner's vision of the Ring as being this totalizing artistic experience. So I do think it's very important in that sense. So I think talking about it with you, my fellow panel members, that I actually have sort of come to have a different appreciation for it. So I think it's quite useful, and thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure to have you, Mr. D, and I think you speak for myself as well. I came into this a little bit kind of jaded, especially with Monty Python, but actually talking about it's reinvigorated. I feel like there needs to be a live watch of it now of some kind at some point.
And even more embarrassing is I can still quote most films.
Yeah. Same.
Well, we'll be able to put on our own version of it then at some point. I'm sure. On a chat sometime, a Twitter space.
There's some lovely filth down here.
I'm 37. I'm not old.
Okay, this is getting scary now. Simon, why don't you go next?
Yeah, it's for me, there's an emblematic scene where in Excalibur, Percival, goes to the Grail castle, brings back the Grail, gives it Arthur to drink from. Arthur's the sick. I mean, he's obviously like Tolkien's Theoden, the sick king that needs to be healed. And he says, he drinks from the Grail, and he says, "I didn't know how empty my soul was until it was filled." And that scene is in itself, it's a capture of a few lines from another Anglo-Saxon poem, The Wanderer. And the line is,
Yes.
"Alas, bright cup, alas, burnished fighter, alas, proud prince, how that time has passed, dark under night's helm, as though it never had been." And that's my point about absence and endings. But as with Eliot, that is also a beginning. That's a jumping off point. And that to me is the sort of, if you like, refreshment from the poignancy of that loss. There is renewal in that, and that is the power of that myth.
And I think as well that for me that's always been the point of Arthur Day. It was never about having just academic discussions. It's always been, this is supposed to rejuvenate and inspire and perhaps lead to the next cycle. I mean, it would be great if it was contributed even in a small way to that.
And as Dee says, as you get older, you feel differently about these things. You don't necessarily inhabit the same passionate drives you had as a young man. It doesn't mean you're sort of any the lesser. It's that you've left certain things, certain things have been put aside and you've moved on. And these myths are still valuable. It's as it were, as jumping off points for action, in a sense, in the future, for culture, for the recrudescence of, what is it, Arthur's line, "We must find what was lost."
Well, then I'll always make the point as well, that Bilbo only set out on his quest when he was 50 years old. So, that Tolkien certainly believed that youth was no guarantee of heroism. But yes, and thank you, Simon, for coming on. I've really appreciated your contribution. And Lady of Shalott, do you want to share any final comments?
Oh, well, I love both these films. I first saw Excalibur when I was very young. It made a huge impression on me. The film doesn't change, but I've changed, and I rewatch it regularly, and I see new things. And obviously, as I'm older, I draw something new from the film, and I think it connects us with the past and a sense of magic that is woefully absent from the world that we're in at the moment, and the world that Arthur lived in at times felt without hope. And I think many of us feel that we're living in a world without hope at times at the moment. But you must prevail, because there really is what's the alternative? You really must. And I really enjoyed the discussion we had about the Holy Grail, because I know there's been a lot of the Python team do get attacked a fair bit by people in our sphere, as seeing that they're in somehow responsible for or they ushered in the kind of mess that we are in now, but they really didn't. And I think you've got to be a bit more nuanced perhaps in your thinking about these things. And I absolutely love both these films. Again, I also love Lancelot du Lac, the 1974 French film, which focuses more on Lancelot, and we see a little bit more about his struggle. That's a great film for anyone who wants to see a film that is visually completely different from Excalibur. I'd recommend you seek that film out. I think, again, it's that thing of we must find what was lost, because I think we have. There's a real existential loss of connection and being and purpose for so many of us in life. And I feel it, but I see it very much in younger people. I see it. I think I worry more. I don't really worry for myself so much, because my life is half over and may well end soon. But I fear for the next generate the young people and how they will navigate this. And I think they're going to have to look to themselves and maybe look back to the ancestors in the myth and legend and try to find something to navigate and to prevail. And it's just a wonderful film. Wonderful. Both of them are. All of them are. Except Guy Ritchie.
Except Guy Ritchie. That's the bum note there.
Oh, sure.
Can I say one last thing about Arthur as well? It's just this is just a sort of frivolous point, really. It's just about the pure joy of story and language as well in its many forms. And
Yes.
I just want to see if I can get Mr. D to say something after I say something. I'm gonna say the charm in the film that's used in Excalibur. It's Anal Nathrach Orthbath Betud Dochiel Yenve, which apparently is a sort of Bowdlerized Irish, Old
It's
Irish.
Old Irish. Yes, it is. Yes.
Which means serpent's breath, charm of death
Mhm.
and life, thy omen of making. And it always reminds me of the Black Speech from Lord of the Rings. I wonder if Mr. D, can you give it to us in full?
Oh no!
It has a similar sound.
Ash. No, I can't do it. I can't do it. Just Ash, Nash. Oh.
Is Ashnaz Dubatuluk?
Gabatul Grimpatul.
Ashnaz Gimbatul. Yeah.
I am terribly embarrassed because I've got that tattooed on my forehead. I don't know. But yeah, sort of very good point. And of course, back to this, the sort of topic of the magic of words, of the power of words. I think this is something I've mentioned somewhere. That even, of course, in the Bible, beginning with the word, the idea that a word has the power to literally change reality, to conjure up things, as happens, certainly in Excalibur. Well, even in Monty Python, I mean the knee, like knee. I mean, it's the kind of power of that word to cause, pain or annoyance, or probably both. A very curious thread that runs through so many great works, through so many sort of mythos. But and one other recommendation I would give, I thought about this, and I don't know if you've discussed it. I haven't had a chance to look at the other King Arthur Day streams, which I certainly will, and everyone else should as well. But the English composer Henry Purcell wrote what is usually called a semi-opera called King Arthur, and
he did indeed. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
It's always been it's been long been a favorite of mine, and so it is very interesting work, and again, it is a mixture of kind of spoken text and absolutely great musical numbers as well. So if people haven't heard it, and in a way, it has a kind of fragmentary nature, and tells the story, in a sort of or circuitous or kind of non-traditionally narrative way. So if people haven't heard it, again, there's some wonderful music. Just a very brief bit of trivia about that is that the way that I became friendly with Academic Agent is that he once posted a video of the German New Wave performer Klaus Nomi performing a song from Purcell's King Arthur, which is called the Cold Song. In the actual music, it's a character called Cold Genius, which is sort of like analogous to Merlin when he becomes frozen, and then has to be thawed with the charm of making again. And so yeah, and you can look this up as well. You can look up Klaus Nomi's performance of this. But yeah, I mean,
I love that. I have to say, I love that song. I love it.
Yeah,
it's been used in that. Yes, beautiful. It's been used in. There's a French film called Un Nos Amour, and it's from 1981, I think, and it's used very prominently in that film, very effectively. It's a beautiful piece of music. I'd urge anyone to seek it out.
Yes, what power art thou who from below hath made me rise unwillingly and slow? And yeah, I mean, wonderful text as well. I can't remember who wrote the text for that, but if people are certainly interested in adaptations of Arthurian legend, the Purcell semi-opera is very, very interesting.
Was it John Dryden who wrote the text for it? I've got a feeling it was Dryden.
It could have been Dryden. Yeah, you may be right about that. I forget everything, so I'm afraid I should know that. But no, it may well be Dryden's text, because it's first class. It's not the work of some mere librettist, but But yeah, yeah, and anyway, AA once posted this clip of Klaus Nomi, and then I said, well, did you know that Klaus Nomi appeared once on Saturday Night Live with singing
David
back up
Bowie.
to David Bowie, and AA just fell in love with me about that. So that's how we came together.
That is some true
anyway,
deepest lore. That is the real deep lore. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I would fully recommend it. I think me and Pharaoh discussed it briefly in our second Arthur and Art stream, so you can find that in the playlist. Lady of Shalott, were you just going to say? Were you going to say something there?
No, I wasn't. No, I just love that piece of music. I'm still thinking about it, and it's incredible. Please seek it out, anyone who hasn't heard it. Yeah.
I also like it as well, and because I like outsider odd performers as well, and I was sort of fascinated by Klaus Nomi for a while, and that music by Purcell was also, should we say, repurposed or stolen by Michael Nyman to do a lot of his soundtrack work for Peter Greenaway in films like The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, and Drowning by Numbers.
Well, I didn't get a chance earlier, but I wanted to thank you, Lady of Shalott, for coming on. It was great to have you involved in Arthur Day, and
thank you so much.
I'm sure I speak for many people in saying we really wish the best for you, and we'll be praying for you. And
thank you.
Yeah, we really hope things go well.
Honestly, that means so much. It meant a lot to come on this morning. It's morning here. To make the video, it takes you out of yourself into another world. Of course, it gave me an excuse, not that I needed one, to rewatch those wonderful films. And thank you so much, and thank you so much to everyone in the chat who have conveyed their thoughts to me, and I really, really appreciate it. We have a really good community of people, and we should always remember that. And we're in very, very difficult times, but there are lots of really good people out there, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Well, you would be the person to know, Lady of Shalott, because you're a moderator in most of these chats.
I've barely been on YouTube for this year at all, really. But I've had to kind of just focus on getting through each day, really. Your life becomes very, very basic. And of course, I've got young children as well, so I have to kind of keep going. But thank you so much. And I've been binge watching all the Arthur events. It's been incredible. People have made such thoughtful contributions, and it's just wonderful. And thank you to you, Nathan, because it must have been a lot of hard work to put this together, to corral people and keep checking that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and getting things in on time.
Here.
Fantastic. I mean, it is a lot of work to put anything like this together. So thank you.
Heroic,
because
indeed.
We wouldn't, heroic. It's a heroic quest, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that, and it's been a great experience. It's been absolutely amazing, the response. Like when I first put the call out, I thought I might get the same amount of material as Wagner Day, which was still a lot. But we've had over like 26 hours worth of content and so I've had to stretch it out, and it's been absolutely wonderful. And I want to express my thanks to everybody who's contributed. I think the level has been of a really high quality and really speaks highly of all of those who have put forward videos, not just analysis, but creative engagement. We've had poetry, we've had visual art, and I want to thank everybody who's watched along as well, because I know you've spent your time during this day when you could be doing something else, engaging with this and supporting it. And I really hope it inspires people. So thank you so much. And we just have a few super chats, and then we'll bounce out. So John Boy for $11.99. Excellent, with fantastic guests. Thank you. Well, thank you, John Boy. And I've seen you around the channel a long time, so I'm very grateful for you contributing on Arthur Day. And I totally agree. Fantastic guests, especially on this stream. And Melon for $1. Thank you very much. Very cute dog. Very cute dog. And oh wow, very generously, the Enriab for £100. Thank you for organising King Arthur Day. That is I mean, every donation is generous. That is incredibly generous, the Enriab.
Well done, Enriab.
Very touched. Thank you so much. Yeah, so all that remains for me to do is once again thank my guests, thank everybody who's been involved in Arthur Day. Thank you for all watching. And I'm going to go and, like Merlin, I'm going to go and have a very long sleep under the rocks now and return at some point in the future. But till then, God bless you all and good night.